From the Dragon Theater in Redwood City, California, I'm Angie Coiro, and this is In Deep, one full hour on one intriguing topic. I wonder if there's ever been a presidential election that's seen as much analysis as 2016's. Now, most of you were around for Bush-Gore, and that's a conversation that is arguably dwarfed by what the hell happened last time. What the hell just happened has yielded answers about economic anxiety, racism, Russian puppetry, America's authoritarian undercurrents. All of those have their place. Steve Almond's take puts all of that under a different umbrella, an examination of the stories we tell ourselves as a country. Psychology, philosophy, spirituality, anthropology, they all rely on digging out what we tell ourselves and why and how that motivates us. Until you unearth your assumptions, until you can see the water that you're swimming in, you cannot begin to change your world. Thus, the title of Steve's latest book, Bad Stories, What the Hell Just Happened to Our Country? And he spends that book, and we spend this hour, eyeballing the delusions that we've labored under that have allowed the catastrophe that we're living in. Steve is an amazingly prolific author and essayist. He spoke to us on the release of his book, Against Football. That's in our archive if you care to check it out. It's another puncturing of an American dream machine. Welcome.
Thank you. Wow. Much nicer introduction than I get when I walk into my family and my children say, "Where have you been? What did you get us?" So, sounds great.
Speaking of your kids,
Yeah.
They make appearances in the book, 3 kids.
They do.
And, you know, we see you in the book as a parent trying to explain the world to them, which is, in a way, helping them to shape the stories they will tell themselves about the country. Here you're trying to explain to adults about confronting what we are. And how do you compare that experience of trying to shape young minds with stories that are new to them versus trying to get us to look at stuff that we just assume is true?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Kids are not sophisticated always thinkers, but they're highly absorbent. So for me, the origins of the book, you know, there's the election, and I had one of those moments that I think probably a lot of parents had. I had at that time, and still have, a 10-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 3-year-old, or they were 9, 7, and 3, so really little kids. And when it was clear what the result of the election was going to be, I had one of these sort of middle-of-the-night moments where they're all sleeping together in this tiny little hotel room, and they're lying asleep, and I just thought, I had 2 thoughts, actually, Angie. The first was, how in God's name am I going to explain to them what just happened in the election? Because again, even if they're not sophisticated thinkers, kids understand mean. Kids understand, oh, I was joking about, or I was joking about somebody who's disabled. I mocked somebody who was disabled, or I bragged about violating somebody's body boundaries. Like, this is what the person who the adult world elected did, as well as being quite upfront about saying lots of stuff that my kids are taught in school and at home is not okay. So the question then is, I was like, how do I explain to my kids that the adult world just elected somebody who really wouldn't be allowed on a playground with them, frankly, if we really held him accountable to the things he said and so forth. And then the other second thought I had, which was somewhat darker, is, well, here I am in my little bubble of privilege as a white guy with, and firmly in the middle class, creative class. What must a family of color, a father of color or an immigrant, particularly one whose immigration status is in question or who is undocumented, or a Muslim American parent, what are they thinking about their capacity to keep their children safe, given the electoral process and its result? And it was really one of those moments where I thought, gee, I've been frightened and upset about previous electoral results. I haven't been worried that I don't have the capacity as a parent to protect my children from the direction in which this country has turned. And so I felt like I needed to be able to explain to them in a way they could understand what the adult world was up to. And because I'm a storyteller, I'm not an academic, I'm not really a journalist, I'm kind of an apostate journalist, the lens through which I see is through story. And I think actually we're a storytelling species. The reason we survived as a species out in the Serengeti when we were a very fragile species was because we were able to create stories that extended the bonds of human kindness beyond just clan or tribe. That's what allowed for currency and trade arrangements and so forth. There was this idea of a common good, and that's what we had over the larger, more powerful species. We could create these stories that would motivate us to behave more compassionately, or at least in a more common sense way, to cooperate in large groups. and the formation of nation states and all the rest followed. And I then thought, well, but also there have been bad stories. Every war is the result of a set of bad stories that people have told about some other set of people, how their rights or their privileges or even their resources are threatened by somebody without. So if good stories can extend the bonds of human kindness, then it follows that bad stories can cause people they can sow discord, cause people to sort of have their common sense clouded by rage or grievance. And rather than looking at the election as a series of outcomes that we sort of see every time we open our browsers in a state of mild excitement, oh, what outrage next, where we can locate virtue within ourselves and sort of evil in the other, maybe it makes more sense to say all of these outcomes that we're seeing are the result of a set of fundamentally fraudulent stories, bad stories, that we have either consented to or that we actively have embraced. And
the thing about stories is that when you're trying to expose a story, you have to be dealing with an audience that first is willing to look,
right,
and then is willing to say, maybe I'm wrong.
right.
And there was a lot of research that started kicking in during the Bush years, and it was this division. We saw it from George Lakoff, we saw it from Chris Mooney, and it was learning how your political point of view explains how you take facts in. There are those who prefer a paternal model, just telling them what is what, the mother who's trying to, draw out from them, what do you believe?
Right.
And then there's what we all carry, which is an ability to just be Teflon to any idea that challenges how we think and what we believe.
Right.
What is the power of the storyteller to get people to look at these and maybe consider that what they think is true is not true?
Well, I can't force somebody, especially in this culture, to pick up a book. And I especially can't force them to pick up a book that attempts to dig under certain stories like the story of race, which is really the sort of original bad story that was forged before we were even a country. The idea that there's some imaginary pigmentary alliance that can get people focused on racial resentment and turn them away from economic justice as a mode of political expression or a final goal. I'm not going to be able to compel people who are deeply attached to the idea of their race and their race as determinant of their moral stature, of their rights in this society and so forth. I'm not going to be able to reach them with this book. What I'm trying to do is explain to what I view to be a very large number of Americans who are really underneath their rage is a confusion and sorrow. How did we reach this point where our political discourse is so angry and so divisive, so divorced from facts, so eager to sow discord and divide us from one another and make us forget that we all want the same thing? We all want to have our families be safe. We all want access to health care. We all want to, or at least most of us, I believe, would agree that equalizing opportunity is sort of the great mission of this country. That those founding ideals that were set out, we all agree with. So my effort is to try to explicate. It's a book that's about trying to explain to people who feel lost in this blizzard of unending bad outcomes and who kind of get lost saying, how did we get so caught up in such an angry, negative, fraudulent cycle that I simply am spending almost all my time reacting to outrages rather than saying, let's take a step back from history. What bad stories did we tell ourselves that got us to this moment? Mm-hmm. So for example, if you want to understand what's happening on the southern border of this country, where families are being, by design by the U.S. government, torn asunder when they come here seeking refuge, you have to understand the United States has always had a complex and fraught attitude towards immigration. You have to look back into the historical record and realize that 150 years ago, there was an editorial in a newspaper saying those Sicilians who are making trouble down there in Louisiana should be treated with lynch law. They're subhuman. They're like rattlesnakes. They're lower than rattlesnakes. And when you read that editorial and see that it was in the New York Times, that it was the New York Times that was suggesting that immigrants were subhuman and should be subjected to lynch law, then you realize, wait a second, those ideas we have about the Statue of Liberty, about welcoming all the huddled masses, those are a bad story. They're wishful. They're wishful in the same way that all men were created equal is wishful.
Which is different than aspirational.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the way I would say it is we have to step back and recognize that some of the fundamental ideas that we hold about the United States are simply not true. We're not a representative democracy. We never have been a representative democracy. We weren't when people owned property, human beings as property. The guy who wrote "All men are created equal" owned other human beings, other men, as property. And our electoral system, including the Electoral College, was essentially done according to slave owner math. It was a negotiation that brought the southern colonies, southern states, into the Union. And we went through an era where most of the people in this room and most of the people listening to this show couldn't have voted. It was only about 100 years ago that women were given the vote. That's not a representative democracy. And we can go through the Jim Crow laws and the poll taxes and the voter suppression efforts. Those all are putting the lie to the wishful idea that we're a representative democracy. And until we reckon with that, here in California, where we're recording this, your vote counts 1/3 as much as somebody in Wyoming. Right? I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which the idea that we tell ourselves we're a representative democracy is simply factually untrue. And until we step back and reckon with that fundamental problem, we're not going to solve the bad outcomes that are a result of that, which is essentially a minority party with mostly plutocratic policies seizing 100% of the power to legislate, pass huge tax cuts for the donor class, ...
If you're just joining us, I'm talking to Steve Almond. His book is Bad Stories, What the Hell Just Happened to Our Country. So you just named a number of ways in which we've been fooling ourselves from the very beginning, including the fact that we discovered America.
Right.
So why did the book start with Watergate?
Well, the book started with Watergate because it seemed to me that the story we tell about Watergate is a bad story. The story we tell about Watergate is there once upon a time there was a corrupt leader. And he proved that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And he reinforced the idea now so common in the body politic here that essentially all politicians are corrupt and all the pursuit of power is inherently corrupt. And therefore, it's our job as a people to sort of absorb that bad news and kind of contort ourselves morally. And it's much of the reason that the big winner in the 2016 election with 104 million non-votes were citizens who simply lost faith in the idea that their vote mattered, and therefore, though they were eligible to vote, did not vote, right? Non-voters, people who simply were too civically apathetic to vote, got way more votes than either of the candidates by, 40 million votes. What is that the result of? That's the result of individual Americans losing faith, partly because the lesson that we tell ourselves, the story we tell ourselves as politicians and the world of politics is inherently corrupt and they're all crooks. But the real story of Watergate, I think, is quite different. There was a president who turned the Oval Office into essentially a criminal espionage operation, and he was caught. And what happened as he was caught was actually a story of collective idealism. Every single civic institution, from the people themselves to our Fourth Estate, to the congressional committees, and to the judiciary, ratified the idea that there is certain conduct that is illegal and immoral and unbefitting and not permissible in our leader, in our elected leader. And it took a while, it took 2.5 years, but ultimately the story of Watergate was a story of collective idealism. That it is not okay for an elected official to conduct criminal acts in the White House or even in the run-up to his being in the White House. And that is something that we should try to remember, because what came out of Watergate was a whole series of reforms that were attempting to get money out of politics, attempting to make sure that the executive powers, the powers of the executive branch were curtailed. And every single one of those reforms was a good outcome that came from the good story of people saying, we can't have a president behaving that way, and we've got to set up a system where they're not even tempted. By the 2016 election, the important thing to realize is that every single one of those reforms that was trying to get dirty money out of politics had been meticulously and quite intentionally stripped away, allowed to lapse, or actively eliminated by the GOP. They had created the circumstances for another bad actor to become president. But Watergate itself was about all the civic institutions that need to be the moral backstop, saying, nope, That kind of conduct is unacceptable, and we are all going to collaborate in the removal of that cancer from the Republic body.
One of the things I want to jump to when we talk about how these things are covered, what stories are told to us,
Right.
The fairness doctrine. Why don't you jump to that?
Well, one of the bad outcomes that is quite distinct from when Nixon was in office is that there was a spoiler plate on propaganda, and I'll sort of go back to what did the founders think of when they talked about the Fourth Estate? They were thinking about pamphlets. They were thinking about printed material, usually that would only be distributed in a very local area. When radio came along at the beginning of the 20th century, they suddenly were faced with the existential reality that there was a medium that could reach millions of people directly into their ears, as we're talking, you and I, incredibly intimate and influential. And legislators, smart lawmakers said, my God, this is something new under the sun. Whoever holds control of these mediums, of these broadcasts, of the airwaves that get that allow radio stations to broadcast to people, could influence tens of millions of Americans. And if they fell into the wrong hands, if they fell into hands of people who are simply interested in fomenting propaganda in order to make money, or spreading a partisan agenda, or trying to increase the profits of particular corporations, that would be a disaster. We have to regulate the public airwaves to make sure they're used to serve the public interest. And out of that basic concern came the Radio Act, and then the Mayflower Act, and then the Fairness Doctrine, all of which were efforts to say, hey, radio and TV people, you're allowed to hold a public license, but you have to agree to serve the public interest. If you're going to talk about a controversial issue, and you have a responsibility to, you're going to have to do so in a way that includes all shades of reasonable opinion that are based in fact. And you cannot simply become an organ of propaganda. In other words, you cannot simply broadcast to people and essentially brainwash them into believing something that is patently untrue. Mm-hmm. Well, that is not the media that we have today. And the reason we don't have that media is because Ronald Reagan, in the Reagan years, he deregulated lots of things. And one of the things he deregulated was media. He appointed people to the FCC who said, you know what? The Fourth Estate is not a civic institution. It's a marketplace, and it should be treated like every other marketplace, right? There shouldn't be any regulations on what people do. If they can find a way to make money off of it, that's fine. It's a market. And the reality is that is essentially what has happened. As soon as the Fairness Doctrine disappeared, you saw the rise of right-wing talk radio and eventually Fox News. And their essential mission is to build an audience. And the way that they build an audience is by telling scary but very compelling stories that essentially say they're coming for your way of life, they're coming for your religion, they're coming for your guns, and they might even be coming for your grandmother.
Yeah.
And the story of the death panel is a fraudulent story. The story that good faith political actors were trying to tell is, we would like to demonstrably improve healthcare delivery systems in your community. Mm-hmm. The story that was told on right-wing radio and Fox News was, the government will create panels and they will euthanize elderly Americans. That was completely disconnected from reality, but a story is a powerful thing. And if you can plug into people's primal negative emotions, their sense of grievance, their sense of fear and rage, you can really sell a lot of survival kits. You can sell a lot of, Viagra or whatever it is that they're selling on these radio shows. And it certainly is a lot of Viagra, right? Partly because the audience of this programming are largely, well, I think they feel culturally, you joke, but I think they do feel disempowered. I think they feel a sense of lost cultural utility. Mm-hmm. And part of what right-wing radio recognized is, like any great demagogic establishment, if you can plug into people's sense of powerlessness, their sense of anxiety about their place in the world, if you can provide them what Hannah Arendt called a telos, a grand narrative that makes sense of the world for them and tells them who is responsible for their feelings of weakness and vulnerability, those dark-skinned others hovering at the border or in your community, then you can get people addicted and you can really indoctrinate them. Bad Stories is not a book that will reach that audience. It's a book reaching the audience trying to figure out, why do we have a media that is partly composed of propaganda? Why has the retailing of bad stories become such a growth industry in the United States?
We've got a lot more to come with Steve Almond. He's sitting here with our audience for In Deep with Angie Coiro. The book is Bad Stories, and we will be right back. Welcome back to In Deep. I'm Angie Coiro. My guest is Steve Almond. You heard him on our airwaves before with Against Football, which is a book I do recommend, and I recommend his new one as well, Bad Stories, What the Hell Just Happened to Our Country. I see kind of a dual purpose when you look at Fox, and especially lately Sinclair Broadcasting. Yes, they are profit-generating machines. Yes, they're determined to get eyeballs in, but we also see in the memos that were released from the early days of Fox telling them what the dialogue of the day would be to aid the Republicans. And then April of this year, Sinclair Broadcasting made dozens of local anchors read the same script, so the same political message would get out. So what I see there is, yeah, we have to understand that they're a commercial entity. We have to understand that the first and foremost thing is profits, but they are likewise propaganda machines who are choosing a very specific message to generate the profits with.
Right, right. It fits into a larger pattern that's falls along the lines of, don't tell me what you're for, tell me who you're against. Tell me who is to blame for my feelings, my internal life, my inner life. One of the big bad stories that's more psychological that I think sort of flows underneath all this is the idea that Americans are uniquely susceptible to exalting their grievances as a way of hiding from their vulnerability. That is what right-wing radio has been doing for 40 years. And when people saw Donald Trump say, oh, it's a revolution, it's not a revolution. He's inherited an audience share that has been for 40 years a kind of ecstatic cult of white victimization that has said over and over and over again, the problem is immigration, the problem is the dark other, the problem is the globalist, all those people looking down on you, all those people with higher education who think you're dumb. That's the problem. The problem isn't mechanization, automation, globalization as a necessary, Americans want cheap products. So how do you get cheap products? You have them assembled in countries where people are willing to settle for less money, right? The reason that the American manufacturing sector has been hollowed out, there are very real reasons for that, and very real reasons for people who were in industries that no longer can pay a decent livable wage for them to be furious and upset. That is not what right-wing radio is trying to identify. Mm-hmm. They're essentially serving the interests of a kind of donor class that is, whose central mission is really to build the alliance between corrupt business and corrupt government. Teddy Roosevelt understood this in 1910. He gave a famous speech called the New Nationalism speech, and he said, look, it is our job to break this alliance between corrupt business and corrupt government. That is the job. That is what lawmakers and elected officials should be doing. And one of the ways that you do that is by trying to sort of propose the basic anti-corruption measures that, for instance, Elizabeth Warren, who's the senator from my state of Massachusetts, just proposed. Say, look, the idea is to say you cannot have a revolving door between our legislative body and the lobbying groups who work for the special interests. You simply have to break those alliances. You can't have billions of dollars flowing into the coffers of a political party so that they will pass huge tax cuts that benefit those corporations. While Trump and his various cronies, this kind of criminal syndicate, while it's dawning on all of us that there's this kleptocracy that's essentially like a mob syndicate, after all, if I stripped all the names and identifying characteristics and simply explained what Trump and his cronies have been accused of, you'd say, wow, that sounds like a crime syndicate. And you would be right. That's what it is. But while they've been doing all that, what's been really going on at the level of policy? The Koch brothers and every other corporate interest in this country got their tax rate cut from 35% to 21%. And, the tax cuts were essentially a boon for the donor class, and that causes the Koch brothers and all the rest of them to, just wrote a $500,000 check to Paul Ryan. Here's some spending money that you're going to need to keep this policy going. Why has Wall Street been utterly silent during all this? Because they had their best day ever when Trump had his worst day ever. You have to follow the money in all this.
What you're doing there is you're bringing together a lot of facts that some people have heard some of them. Some people have heard all of them. You interview and encounter people in the book who are just resistant to that.
Yeah.
One woman who, feeling her approval of Trump was reliant in part on her disapproval of Michelle Obama for showing her arms. It was
Right.
not appropriate for a first woman to be showing her arms. She's telling herself some kind of story
Right.
that allows her to dismiss the public nudity of
Right.
the first woman to be,
Right.
but also how important these other things are, economics and the right to have a decent life.
Right. I think what the GOP has increasingly become about is criminalizing female volition and female ambition. I think lock her up was the central message at the GOP. I don't remember a lot of other policies being discussed other than America's, carnage in the inner cities and all these veiled references to the law and order stuff. But the central message, if you think back to the convention that one entire major American political party had, the central image from that convention, we can agree, was a mob chanting, "Lock her up, lock her up." I think it was essential to understanding the election to say part of the business here is really a kind of unexamined and unacknowledged hardcore misogyny and set of patriarchal values that says any woman of ambition, any woman with the temerity to want to have power and even volition in the world should be criminalized, should be locked up. I don't think they were just talking about Hillary Clinton. I think they were talking about every other woman who dares to want to have volition and particularly in our culture, power. It was a very easy way to plug into a very ancient story, which is that men should have the power. Men have always had the power. They're more powerful physically. They're more powerful intellectually. They don't worry about chasing after kids and women's work and domestic drudgery. And therefore, they should continue to have the power in the professional world.
How did that manifest in the coverage of, for example, the email scandal?
Well, you had this kind of remarkable, just remarkable double standard. Try to imagine tape of Hillary Clinton that is released, in which Hillary Clinton brags about sexually assaulting and grabbing young male consular attachés in her time as Secretary of State. She's bragging to one of her aides in the workplace. Yeah, you can just grab them by the bleep. Yeah, you can just even tickle their you-know-what. They'll let you do anything when you're Secretary of State. Can you even enter a world imaginatively where Hillary Clinton would be allowed to speak that way about the other gender? Can you imagine a world in which Hillary Clinton, inveighing against hillbilly rapists, these backward people from Appalachia who, need to be limited, would keep them in their region because they're inbred? Okay? That's a version of what Trump said about the entire population. And you can go down the list. If Hillary Clinton had mocked a reporter for being disabled, a Fox News reporter, just gone up there on stage and said, "Oh, look at it." Do you even understand the kind of double standard that we were involved with? Now,
And why did the press not call that out?
I think they attempted to call it out to the extent they could, but I think that there was a deep sense, mostly unexamined, even within the press. What I want to say is the patriarchy, you're soaking in it. We don't even think about these questions. And 11% of the coverage of the election was about Hillary Clinton's emails, 11%.
And Chris Cillizza, you mentioned that narrow window in which he did 60 different articles on Clinton's emails.
Correct. 10% of the coverage was about policy. Think about how many opportunities the press had to question the candidates. Think about the debates. We had 3 debates where in an unfiltered way you were able to question the person who was going to be the leader of the executive branch. There were zero questions about climate change during any of those debates. So the problem is really much more fundamental, but I think there's a kind of baked into American culture. There are a lot of men walking around who feel that their privilege is being intruded upon, the natural assumption that they should have a better shake in things because they're the man. And I think, the GOP and Trump quite vigorously exploited that bad story within his base. And as much as people were distraught on one side, I think people, it all depends on your constituency. I don't think the Democrats would ever be okay, and I'm not trying to sanctify the Democratic Party or anything. I was a Bernie supporter. I don't care about parties. I care about policies. But you don't get perfect choices.
That's a delusion that we have, though. There's a delusion out there that there is a pure candidate to be found.
Yeah, I think that's a delusion. And I think, people understood that even at the founding of the country, compromise, compromise, compromise. You're not going to get the perfect candidate. But what a lot of people did, I think, was a kind of false equivalency, and I write about this in the book. If you're a woman, how do you justify, and a feminist, right? I was there at this conference that was about female empowerment in the corporate sector, and I'm talking with this woman. It's just a few days after the Access Hollywood tape has come out, in which a candidate for president has bragged about sexually assaulting women, and I said, boy, here I am at this conference for female empowerment, and here's this vice president of human resources at a big Bay Area media company. I'm going to ask her what she makes of this. It's an unprecedented circumstance. And I said, boy, what do you think? Are you following the election? It was just a few days before the election. She said, oh, they're both corrupt. And I said, okay, well, so tell me about that. Email, Benghazi, these code words for Hillary's corrupt. And I said, well, what about Trump? He just had this tape come out. What do you make of that? I was trying to not sort of get into an argument, but how do you justify that as a feminist who's at a conference about female empowerment? And she said, well, at least he never laughed at a rape victim. And I said, what are you talking about? And she told me this story about how Hillary Clinton had laughed at a rape victim and defended a rapist and so forth. And I had to go online and find this bad story, which was one of these propagandistic stories that had to do with Hillary Clinton being assigned. She was forced by a judge to be the defense counsel for somebody who was accused of rape, and she was telling a journalist about how ineptly that case had been prosecuted and how essentially the victim of the rape had been done a disservice by prosecutorial misconduct, and she laughed in a way that was kind of anguished. Our criminal justice system does not protect victims of this sort. And that became, in her telling of the story, oh, she laughed at a rape victim. Well, why does she have to tell that story? She has to tell that story because the feminist part of her, who believes in equality, has to somehow get around to reckoning with the part of her that says, I'm either not going to vote for Hillary or I'm going to vote for Trump. And so she tells herself a patently fraudulent story fed to her by the right-wing propaganda stories that are out there that says, well, Hillary Clinton's even worse, this kind of false equivalency. Again, I don't think Hillary Clinton is pure as the driven snow, but it is quite obvious that she got into public life and that her mission is to actually try to govern and make things better for most people. Anybody with a functioning frontal lobe and a functioning conscience recognizes at this point that Trump does not care about anybody other than himself, and that he's not interested in governing. He's interested in campaigning. He's interested in feeding his bottomless need for adulation, because inside he clearly feels like a pretty small person. And
I'm waiting for you to say something I disagree with so I can be quite the journalist here, but hold that thought.
Okay.
Steve Almond, author of Bad Stories, What the Hell Just Happened to Our Country. You're listening to In Deep, and I'm Angie Coiro. I want to get to some of our questions that we have here.
Sure.
I know you've talked before about the Parkland students, and they are people who are writing a news story for themselves.
Yeah.
Do you think the Parkland students will spark a significant, newly idealistic movement? And talk about the narratives there.
Yeah. So the Parkland students were contending, suddenly, were going to high school and trying to be high schoolers, worrying about whatever, the prom or whatever they worry about. And suddenly, a person with a gun came and shot up their school and killed a bunch of their classmates. And they had a moment of reckoning where they said, geez, it's not just something that happens on TV. It happened. I saw it. I was terrified. I could have been killed. A classmate, even a sibling of mine, was killed. And they then looked at the set of stories that were told about gun violence in this country and recognized, because they had a good journalism teacher at that public school, these stories are bad stories. Every other industrialized country on earth has recognized that the curtailing of access to weapons of deadly force creates, miraculously, through some Byzantine process, fewer schools getting shot up, or churches, or restaurants, right? So they just simply, like a kid would, looked at it, did one probably Google search worth of research, and recognized, my God, Washington is not operating according, the adult world is not operating by logic, by basic common sense moral logic. And then they did a little bit more research and realized, oh, I see, there's the gun manufacturing lobby. Gun manufacturers essentially have as their servants Congress people who continue to ignore the common sense reality that every other industrialized nation has figured out, which is that this is a solvable problem. And they essentially did not consent to quietly accepting the thoughts and prayers of a bunch of, I don't want to say, I'm not going to curse, a bunch of fraudulent politicians who ultimately go to work every day and defend the interests of the gun lobby and endanger kids and innocent citizens, because it's more important for them to get a check from the NRA than it is for them to protect their constituents. And they were not okay with that. And they began to, they used their unassailable right as victims of this tragedy to try to undo some of those bad stories. And there's a great deal of hope in that, just like there's a great deal of hope in the teachers, not on coastal California or crazy fringy New England, but in Arizona, in Oklahoma, in West Virginia, who banded together and said, you know what? It doesn't make sense that we as teachers carry out one of the most important roles in the entire culture, and we're not paid a livable wage. We have to spend our own money on school supplies. Something's morally out of whack. And what they did is what Americans have always done, especially during the labor movement. They banded together and said, it's not okay. It's not acceptable for you to degrade the practitioners of what you say is one of the most important jobs in the culture. And they banded together and they have negotiated for better wages. These are good stories. These are the things that should give us faith that when citizens become active, they can actually rewrite history.
There's a story that goes through American culture that it is only in the most extreme cases involving something as egregious as Holocaust that you were allowed to evoke 1930s Germany. But we also hear the comparison being made a lot. One of our audience members asked, can you compare and contrast the current propaganda environment to Germany in the 1930s? Is that valid? And is there something to the shutting down of that, saying, don't compare things to Hitler?
Yeah. Well, they're very different historical eras. What the Nazis did is gain power with a thin minority, 33%, right? And they were able to negotiate. And then they seized almost 100% control through the Nuremberg laws, et cetera, of media. And they became essentially a vast propaganda machine. What we have is kind of self-service propaganda. And this is where the chapter on the internet is relevant. What we've done is essentially say, you get to make your own reality. If you can find a fact set to support the idea that Hillary Clinton laughed at a rape victim, well, okay, somebody out there will cook that up as a way of aggregating attention for the sponsors. They'll tell whatever kind of wild tale will keep the viewer enthralled and frightened, or maybe frightened and enthralled. And but it's quite different because Hitler had a program. He had a plan. Germans as a country felt aggrieved because of the terms of the last World War. There was hyperinflation, so the culture was really in crisis. What I will say is that it is obvious that nobody says of 1930s Germany, nobody says, yeah, but there were some good Germans. There were some good Germans there who were trying to do the right thing. History really does decide in the end whether a culture is a culture of faith or a culture of faithlessness. And that's ultimately what Bad Stories is aiming at. We have to renew our faith in our capacity as citizens to become subjects of history rather than objects of histories. And if we don't, history will look at us as morally depraved. And certainly our children will say, my God, you did nothing? You did nothing in this moment where it was clear that every scientist was saying that you have to start taking steps or our climate is going to become more berserk and migration rates are going to become more chaotic and extremism and violence will become more rampant in our globe. And you did nothing? You were busy hate-watching democracies decline? Were you people mad? So that is a similarity where I feel like we have to decide, and that's what Bad Stories is asking, are we willing to re-engage with our faith as citizens? And if we don't, what's the price on the other side?
We're going to come back with more of Steve Almond. His book is Bad Stories, What the Hell Just Happened to Our Country. We will get to the more optimistic, forward-looking end of the book.
Yes.
And more. I'm Angie Coiro. Stick around. We'll be right back. Welcome back to In Deep. Thank you for tuning in. If you're just joining us, you've missed any part of the show, you'll find this and our complete show archive at indeepradio.com/podcasts. We talked a little bit about the disempowering of women and how that played into so many women voting for Trump. And it was just a moment of poetry. You were dealing with these ranch hands. You were dealing with the castration of bulls.
Yeah.
And there was a point where you got handed a bull testicle.
I did.
Rife with comedy, but there was an important point you were making there about the role of the one woman in that picture. Can you tell that story and how that fills in, how that fits here?
It's a crazy story. Years ago, I went to write about this ranch, and it was in this ecosystem, there were these young ranch hands, and they hated me because I was from the big city. I had my wingtips. I was hateable. I mean, I knew nothing of their life, and I was sort of parachuting in, as journalists will, and sort of like, hey guys, and trying to somehow find a way into their world. And they were rightfully mistrustful of me because I was going to flatten them out into a two dimensions, into a story. But after 2 or 3 days of trying to sort of curry favor with them, desperately trying to get them to talk with me, finally on the last day, we're all having lunch. It's got to be 100 degrees, and these young ranch hands were sitting under this mesquite tree, and one of them called out to me, hey, journalists, we got something for you. We got a gift for you. They had been castrating bulls and bringing them in from the pasture and so forth, so I'd been writing about that. And I, in my own 22-year-old narcissistic bulletproof way, thought, oh, I've softened them up with my charm, my big city charm. They love my wingtips and my bowling shirts, And so I said, okay. And so this one of them walked over and said, this is for you, in a kind of husky voice. And I held out my hand, and this cowboy put this warm, large, wet thing in my hand, and it was the aforementioned cow testicle. And what was interesting is that I looked at the cowboy and I realized something I hadn't realized before, which is that it was a woman. It was a female cow person, and that she had been sent by the young men to carry out this task, to humiliate the big city yokel, or big city slicker. And that when I looked at her, I could tell that she hadn't wanted to do it, but she had done it because the patriarchy had said, go, humiliate the guy from the big city. And I think there is an element of that is, in some ways, it's easier to identify with the known oppressor than to live in a world where the structures that govern the way that the genders operate is suddenly in question. People find change destabilizing, not just the powerful group, but the oppressed group. And sometimes you identify with the oppressor. And this was an instance where I thought, boy, this is kind of like what Trump did to the country, is kind of sent all those white women, 51% of them, to basically say to the elitists from the big city, screw you. The old way works for us. Even though I think she felt remorse about that. But it was a very odd association. The book is filled with data from political scientists and lots of stories from literature, because I think literature is one way, that's the ultimate way that storytelling is trying to understand what it means to be human and so forth. But it's also full of personal anecdotes like that have stuck with me over the years, and that sort of came zooming back to me as I was trying to understand what the hell just happened to the country.
There are 2 different parts of the book that deal with amusement.
Yes.
You have bad story number 6, what amuses us can't hurt us, and bad story number 12, our court jesters will rescue the kingdom. I want to commend you. In bad story number 6, you brought up an old book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, which I think is very unfortunate that's kind of fallen. People don't really know about that book anymore. Talk about what was explored in that book that's still so relevant.
It's by the cultural historian Neil Postman. And Amusing Ourselves to Death was written at the dawn of the Reagan Revolution. Personal computers hadn't become a thing, or were just becoming a thing. And it was about television, really. And what it was saying is, look, if a culture agrees to simply become an audience that is passively receiving everything as entertainment and can no longer conduct a serious discussion of policy, of morality, of civic obligation, then that country is no longer a republic. It's merely an audience. And that culture begins a death spiral. Now, if you trace forward what has happened since Reagan was in office, we have increasingly, and this has to do with that chapter about the political parodists of our age, we have increasingly viewed politics as something we consume rather than something that we are all a part of. And so we think on the left, the right has been busy constructing a picture of America as a horror movie, where the dark other is hovering at all times and, everybody's always out to get you, what Richard Hofstadter called the paranoid style in American politics. Conspiracies are rife, the unseen person is around the corner, so forth. On the left, we have our own bad story, which is that it is enough to watch brilliant political parody like Jon Stewart or Samantha Bee or whoever it is. And if we simply consume that, we're solving the problem of the civic dysfunction. And in fact, the story we've told ourselves is that America is a farce. If the right is busy portraying America as a horror movie, we've written off America as a farce. But the trick to that is that Jon Stewart and Samantha Bee and John Oliver, even though they're doing lots of laudable things, they're pointing out hypocrisy, they're sharpening people's critical faculties, they're even being explanatory journalists. In the case of John Oliver, he's terrific at explaining in depth, in a way that the major news stations don't, how payday lending works, predatory lending, or dot, dot, dot. He's terrific in those capacities. But ultimately, those people are entertainers. And their job is to convert your civic distress into disposable laughs, to provide therapy, essentially. But sometimes the things that are happening in the culture are of enough seriousness, as Postman would say, that we should be distressed. We should be distressed that teachers and social workers are paid a pittance, and home health care workers, right? We should be distressed that we worship wealth, that we have a president who constructs a reality that is the exact opposite of what the Sermon on the Mount preached, what the Beatitudes said, which is that it's the least among us that we should be thinking about first, right? And least of all ourselves. That's not a farce. That's a tragedy. And some of why we rely on comedians on the left is because we don't know what to do with our feelings of powerlessness. And so what we do is we try to make less the grief of them. But in the process of doing that, I think we drain a certain amount of understandable anger and distress that's necessary in order to get us off of our tushes, away from our screens, and into the streets, or at least to reinvigorate our faith in our citizenship and the way in which we can still save the republic if we're willing to take action. So there's a kind of passivity on the left, I think. Jon Stewart, after all, was sending the same message, a very familiar message. What was he saying for years as the host of The Daily Show? The media is corrupt and the politicians are corrupt. You can't believe any of them, they're all snakes. Well, that was the central pitch that Donald Trump made at every one of his rallies and continues to make. I'm going to drain the swamp, everybody's dirty in Washington, you can't trust any of them, and you can't trust the media. Do you understand? We were colluding against our own idealism when we consent to the idea that an entertainer is going to be our moral backstop. Whenever the fool is the only voice of reason, the kingdom is out of balance. Look at King Lear. When the fool is the one person who's able to speak truth to the king, you know that the kingdom is morally out of balance. And that is not going to be cured by the fool speaking to the king, because the fool has no power. And in this case, the fool isn't really interested in America improving itself and people having more faith, because Jon Stewart and Samantha Bee and all the rest of them, like the rest of the media, are making money off of this civic dysfunction. After all, Michelle Wolf, when she was there at the correspondents' dinner, was right. The New York Times and CNN and all the rest of these outlets love the fact that Trump has made scandal and news popular again. Les Moonves announced to everybody in February of 2016, I know that Donald Trump's terrible, I know he's leading us down a dark path, but man, the money's rolling in. Well, if the leader of a major network can so blithely announce his moral bankruptcy at a conference for Goldman Sachs folks, you know that the media is no longer a civic institution. You know that it's a for-profit arrangement. And that means that we as citizens have to change our media diet, because so long as we're consuming politics as entertainment, passively consuming it, they're going to continue to stage these ridiculous brawls where pundits yell at one another, and they're going to continue to mock our circumstances rather than exhorting people to somehow change our circumstances. A lot of what I'm trying to discuss at the end of the book has to do with faith, We have to reconnect to this deep need to believe. And one way I think that we do that is by stepping away from our tribal contempt and saying, you know what, there are no bad people. There's no bad people. That's a bad story. The bad people, and if the right tells that story vehemently, I don't think the left should. I don't think people of good faith should try to flatten out anybody else. Human beings are full of good stories and bad stories. When the bad stories are more powerful, we behave selfishly, we behave cruelly, we suppress our empathy for other people. We become, to put it broadly, I say this as an atheistic Jew, unchristian. We no longer believe what I believe Christ was trying to preach, which is kind of radical gospel of love as a revolutionary force.
Well, what frankly, I wanted to nominate you for sainthood a number of times during the book, because you would say things about what kind of family life Donald Trump must have grown up with and what it means to have, to grow up without love. And I thought, my hat's off to you, but I don't feel like I've got the capacity for that anymore.
Well, I'm a writer. My job is to figure out not why human beings behave well, but why they behave self-destructively. Nobody is born saying, wah, wah, I'm out to get them. Everybody at birth has the capacity to absorb bad stories when they feel weak or vulnerable or, angry or hungry for something, and also to construct good stories that allow them, hopefully with the help of their community, their parents, their community, their teachers, their country, that help them curb their destructive, impulses. Love, evil is the distortion of love. It doesn't arise from nothing. So if Donald Trump is somebody who cannot extend forgiveness to the world, it's because he can't forgive himself. He can't love effectively. It doesn't mean I approve of his actions. I'm daily disgusted by him, but I'm not interested in the expression of that disgust. I'm interested in the renewal of our capacity to choose leaders who more closely reflect our wishes about the world, that we want to solve these serious problems that we are facing as a country, and we have a small window to do so. And I say that as a person who's got these 3 little kids. And you don't want to think in a dark direction, but geez, there are wildfires raging in this state. Fiji was blown off the map. There's a larger group of people migrating from from places that have become inhospitable to human life because the climate of this planet is changing. And it is changing very quickly, much more quickly than scientists can even come up with, because of human activity. And we have to start having a serious discussion about those kinds of problems, as well as how to distribute wealth in this country in a way that makes sense for the many rather than the few. People don't realize that the tax rates under Eisenhower, right? If Trump is hearkening back to when America was great, a lot of it is the post-World War II boom. Well, the tax rates for the highest earners under Eisenhower were what? 90%. Under Kennedy, they were 75%. It turns out that redistributive tax rates create a boom in which there's a thriving middle class, not a middle class that simply that has to work even harder, and drive longer distances to their jobs and be more and more frustrated and have that feeling of, I can't keep up. It's demagogues who prey on those feelings and convert those feelings into raw political power. It's effective politicians and leaders who say there are structural problems in the way that capitalism is operating right now, that we need to take a few yachts away from the very rich so that we can ensure educational opportunity and health care for the many. These aren't controversial ideas. Honestly, unless you're a zillionaire or a demagogue, these are pretty common sense ideas. And it's about time for politicians to start articulating them, because I think eventually, not to the people who have been indoctrinated for 40 years by bad stories, but most Americans, I believe, want the same set of things. I don't believe there are bad people. I think there are people that all of us are under the influence of good stories and bad stories. And it's kind of a continual battle within ourselves to try to do the right thing. And even if people behave in a political way that feels to me destructive or inimical to their own ends, even if they vote for a candidate who's clearly a demagogue who's going to take away their health care, they could still be a fantastic parent, a fantastic neighbor, a fantastic parishioner. Do you see what I mean? It's really a trap to flatten anybody out. And it's my training as a writer and storyteller to not do that, because I know that I'm full of bad stories as well as good ones.
One of our audience members wants to talk about how you live out your own standards. You were working with Boston College until you resigned publicly because of
Right.
Condoleezza Rice. Can you go into that?
Well, only briefly, which is to say, I was teaching as an adjunct at Boston College, and a number of things had happened behind the scenes where there was a candidate who was going to be hired who was gay, and he ended up not being hired. And a lot of people in the English department where I work, because this was a famous poet, were really distressed by that. And then there was a few other decisions where I realized the administration does not see things the way I do. And they invited Condoleezza Rice. This is in 2006 when she's, New Orleans is underwater and she's in New York buying fancy shoes. And she's serving on the board of ExxonMobil, and here they are, and she's also been one of the central architects of this disastrous war in Iraq. And what the administration of BC was saying was to every kid who is graduating, not just she has free speech, she's allowed to speak, but she is receiving an honorary degree, and you should follow her moral example if you want to achieve in life. And I simply profoundly disagree with that perspective. I think she's a very intelligent person who has put that intelligence to morally questionable, and I'm trying to be polite, morally questionable ends. And I felt I had a little opportunity to say, I do not consent to receive a paycheck from an institution that violates its own stated values. It feels hypocritical to me. And that was no big deal. It was just something that I could do. I'm much happier to talk about what I'm trying to do now as we are coming into the home stretch of what I think is the most important election of my lifetime. And I'm 51, and I was watching Watergate and remember the elections, Ford, Reagan, Carter. I mean, I remember a lot of elections. I don't say lightly that this is the most important election of my lifetime. I say it because in one way or another, like it or not, the right has announced who they are. They have said, here's what we're okay with. We are okay with this. As long as Wall Street gets their tax cuts, as long as this corrupt alliance between business and government, the pipeline there stays open, we are okay with all manner of depravity, moral depravity. We don't care how despicable and juvenile somebody is. We don't care how cruel they are. We don't care if families are getting ripped apart. We don't care if middle-class Americans, we don't care if we're not solving problems. As long as we're solving problems for our donor class, problem solved. They are always, 100% of the time, going to put corporate interests before human interests. And we now know that. We have no excuse if we do a rational assessment of what's happening in Washington and follow the money, that's what's happening. So the question then becomes, when a political party has reached that point, that moral nadir, who is everybody else? Because after all, this is still an electoral democracy. And realistically, they're never going to impeach Trump until his numbers, plummet. So then what are you left with as a remedy? The only remedy that we have as a mature democracy is to repudiate politicians who consent to an arrangement, who consent to an arrangement where one party is merely serving corporate interests. They're only going to change their behavior if they are not successful at the polls, because the only reason they cling to a set of behaviors that I try to articulate in Bad Stories is because it gets them power. It's self-perpetuating at this point. So what I'm trying to do, to the extent possible, is talk about bad stories but also, because I'm a teacher of writing, I've been holding workshops that are fundraisers where I ask students, rather than paying me, to give $150 or $200 to an organization that's dedicated to a candidate or cause that they believe in, that's dedicated to social justice or electoral justice. I'm trying to do everything I can as an individual citizen with my very limited talent and sort of power in the world to say, what can I do to be politically active? The time, anguish is understandable. It's completely understandable. Action is required. And I feel like part of the problem that we're stuck in the left, and that I'm trying to address in Bad Stories, is you can understand. I hope the book helps people understand how we got to this point. There is only one path out. And that is for us to not wallow in sort of our own virtue signaling and our own vilifying of the other side and our, sort of hate-watching democracy on cable TV, but actually becoming more active as citizens. That's the only way out. People always say, what should we do? What should we do? Who's going to save us? Will the millennials save us? Will the news media save us? No. Everybody in this theater are the people who are going to save us. It's like in church. You have to look at the person next to you and say, well, what are you going to do? Because history is going to want to know, and your grandkids and your kids are going to want to know, well, what did you do when it was clear that democracy had turned in such a dark direction and was really only protecting the interests of the very powerful and rich? At that moment, at that moral crossroads, did you lose faith and just give up and sit back and watch it unfold and say tisk tisk or laugh at it? Or did you get up out of your chair and take to the streets in one way or another? Doing, through whatever political action best serves your abilities. For me, it's teaching these little workshops and trying to talk about this book and remind people we're not just the objects of history. We're the subjects of history. We don't have to consent to a story in which we're helpless before all of this. The beauty of the democratic experiment in self-governance is that even if we follow a mad Ahab on his quest to sort of vanquish his wounded male ego and democracy turns in a dark direction for a while, if enough people set their shoulders to the pendulum of justice, it swings the other way. And that requires a belief in the possibility of your own citizenship making a difference. And that's ultimately sort of the ultimate good story that I hope comes out of the book.
There's a reason that if you look for Steve Almond on YouTube, there's a picture of him. You can find videos of him behind a pulpit. You just heard it. So
right.
Thank you very much for being here.
Sure, my pleasure.
Steve Almond with his book, Bad Stories, What the Hell Just Happened to Our Country. You've been listening to In Deep with Angie Coiro. Today's show was produced at and in cooperation with the Dragon Theater. We are here every other week for our daytime programs in addition to our evening shows at Kepler's Books. You can keep up with our schedules by signing up for our newsletter. Send your email address to info@indeepradio.com. Our shows are available on PRX and iTunes. We're on Twitter @InDeepRadio. Our producer is Carol Lee Hazard. Engineer Scott McDowell. Associate engineer is Brittany Lee Wagner. Our closing music is by David Gans. The In Deep dog is Bear. Our founding producer is Gordon Whiting. Special thanks to Kim Wadecki and Josiah Frampton here at The Dragon. I'm Angie Coiro. Thank you for tuning in to In Deep.
Oh, well, the man who stole the future has an oil drum for a heart and a strange preoccupation with other people's private parts. They want us to do what they say, but I'd rather live my own damn way. We'll take our culture back someday, but it's gonna get worse before it gets better. It's gonna get worse before it gets better. It's gonna get worse before it gets better, but I know it's gonna get better. Yes, I know it's gonna get better, 'cause it almost always does. I can't say much about the who and how, but I believe it just because.